What is up, guys? Fado82 coming at you with another edition of Rust Cribs. This is the 19th edition of Rust Cribs, and it's amazing that it's been 19 episodes so far, and we're taking a look at footage from the past two wipe cycles from the US Rustopia server. As always, Rustopia is a vanilla Rust server, which means there's no special gather rates, no increased resources, so the players who are building the bases here have a 1 week wipe cycle to build these compounds or these bases, and that's it. So this is pushing vanilla Rust to its limits. It's a high population server, so you tend to see some larger scale builds here because there are some bigger clans. Taking a look right off the bat here, we see a base that is taking advantage of the terrain here. I really like how they terraced the build here and built up this mountain slope with the snow being at the top there. It really gives them some added protection, and if you can make use of the topography on the map to complement your base design, that's always going to be something that's going to really give you an advantage, because where you build oftentimes decides your fate in Rust. Taking a look at a base here, this one is under construction. You can see members working hard to get this base up and running. This is a water base. It's not built too deep in the water, so it's not going to be something that's going to be terribly hard to get to, but just standing in the water does make players more prone to the elements. It makes them colder. If they don't have building privilege, they can't throw down a fire to warm up, so there are some added benefits to doing a water-based build, even if you're building in shallow water. Those triangles around the base, those are auxiliary building cabinets which extend out their building radius, so that is something that always you want to employ in your base designs as well. The more cabinets that you put up, the farther out your radius is going to be. There always is a main cabinet though, which is the one you want to protect the most. Taking a look at this build here, it looks like quite a mess. There's a lot of things added on top, but this oftentimes is what builds will look like in Rust. As players iterate on builds, it's hard to make them look aesthetically pleasing. Building in Rust has always been sort of more based on function over form. Rather than making something look nice, it is based on the functionality of the build, how secure it's going to be, how many layers there are to it. So oftentimes that results in builds that don't come out, that are, not that pleasing to the eye. I will say I've been quite pleased with what I've seen on Rustopia and on some other Rust servers also with base builds where they're very secure but also very symmetrical and they look nice as well. But in general, building in Rust, whether it was Legacy or Rust now, has always been about keeping your loot as secure as it can be, making those loot rooms as hidden as they can be, as secure as possible. And you can pick up a few tips from KCMO. The last wipe cycle on Rustopia, he put his build to the test, so you can't say that he's somebody who does builds and doesn't actually play the game, because he's out here on a high pop server in the wild putting his build to the test, and it did withstand the test of time. He utilized one of the new rock formations and built his own cave build. It's not necessarily a cave build. He did refer to it as being a cave build. It's actually a rock with two openings here, and he made sort of his own cave. So it's a man-made cave, if you will, but not a naturally forming cave. There's a difference in the rock builds because some are caves that don't have an exit to it, but this was a rock that had 2 points of entry to it. But he did, for all intents and purposes, make his own cave. And looking at the build here, he has that tower which gives him a 360-degree firing radius at the top, so he's going to be able to defend against that. He was able to integrate the high exterior stone walls into the build itself, and he has a method here which he builds up and goes over into the base, and it adds some added protection to it. To take a look at this build in depth, go ahead and check out KCMO's build on the Rusty Pirates channel, and you can see exactly how this build was made and exactly how it withstood the test of time on Rustopia. Just taking a look here, one of the tricks he did employ here is a crafty measure with a turret here, where his turret Henry is peeking through the roof slope, the slant of the roof here, which is going to light up anybody who comes in that inner courtyard. So that's a bit of a glitchy mechanic, but KCMO's been known to get stuff patched in Rust, so chances are that won't be around forever, so go ahead and use it. As of the last version of Rust, last week's patch, the value for the high exterior stone walls, wood walls, and also the accompanying gateways has changed in that it's now going to be less resource intensive to get through. So many endgame builds were incorporating the high exterior stone walls into their designs, and it now takes 3 C4 to get through a high exterior stone wall, which is substantially less than it cost before. This is important because it's going to shake things up in favor of raiders. Every patch is delicate in terms of shifting the balance between base defenders or raiders. But as you can see here, bases start off small. The Plan Clan has a small base here, but they eventually evolve into something like this with higher groups on vanilla Rust servers. The larger groups will farm at a very intense rate, and they have it down to a science in terms of how they place their towers, their main structures, and they know how they're going to be building their compound before they even set out to do it. They do have to adapt to the landscape because they don't always know what the map's going to look like prior to the seed being developed. But once they pick a spot, they farm feverishly, and the type of bases that are coming out that we're seeing on high population Rust servers now, even with a 1 week wipe cycle. Keep that in mind, guys, while you're watching all this footage. These are 1 week wipe cycle bases. But the type of bases we're seeing coming out are ones that are very resource intensive to raid, and that's something that you always have to balance, because you want bases that are going to be vulnerable, and bases that get to be this big with this amount of resources, even on a 1 week wipe cycle. You almost can't farm enough resources unless you ally with a lot of other groups to be able to raid that type of compound. And it's really no fun if you're not feeling vulnerable in Rust, or if you get to a point where your base is impenetrable. Not that these bases are bases that can't be raided, but they weren't raided, and typically on Rustopia we see that type of activity going down. So I think it was just a case where the people who would want to raid the base didn't have the amount of resources, and figured to expend the amount of rockets they had, they would only breach part of the courtyard, which would have made it very frustrating. As you can see here, some of the members had extra resources and put into design some sculptures with their names, with their clan tags. That's something that people will often do with their base designs, whether it's signs or structures that they build. That is, they'll build shrines, monuments to themselves, to other people, to events on the server, and that's part of kind of the lore and the history that develops on Rust servers, and that's unique to each and every server. Taking a look inside here, you'll see that they have various signs here. I'm not sure what they say. If anyone can decipher the Korean language, let us know if these signs say anything bad, and we'll go ahead and make sure we're aware of what's going on there. As we go ahead and move on over, we're going to take a look at CML's compound throughout the last couple wipe cycles. CML, like the Plan Clan, is very good at building and utilizing the existing landscape, and they're very good at land management. Rust has turned into a bit of a land management game, and what that means is that groups are now walling off vast tracts of land and taking them over. Sometimes they'll wall off a rad town or an area that is something that is going to have a lot of resources. That's always been part of Rust, even back in the days of Legacy, taking over plots of land, taking over different geographic areas. But what we're seeing now is it done on a much greater scale, and that's due to all of the furnaces, the quarries, the pump jacks that were in the game previously but aren't really able to be placed in base designs right now, but you can still use the pump jacks at some of the rad town areas. And these resources that you're able to gather at a quicker rate results in bases that are sprawling out into the landscape, and results in players taking over the landscape. So Rust has interestingly turned a little bit away from Legacy. In Legacy, we didn't feel it really felt like players were taking over the map necessarily. They had their little places where their bases were, but I never felt like it was almost a strategy game. But now Rust almost feels like players are really trying to conquer the map. Certain groups are really trying to take it over, and that is a really interesting dynamic. As Rust grows and iterates, who knows where it'll go, but it definitely seems to be going on a larger scale. And again, this is a 1 week wipe cycle server. On servers with longer periods, you're probably going to see players taking over even larger amounts of the map, which in my mind can get a bit problematic, because if the maps are too controlled by certain groups, it really detracts from some of the experience of players who don't have access to all those resources, and it might just create a power imbalance. So that's something that I think the developers need to think through. It's hard to really figure out how to manage that, because players are going to go out there and do what they're going to do, which is try to survive, and not only survive but thrive in Rust. And that's what these big groups are doing. CML, Plan, they are thriving. They're utilizing their manpower, their resources to build the biggest bases, the hardest to raid bases, and it's really quite a stunning example. If you played Rust all along the way, we never quite thought it would get to this level, but it's really something to behold. In terms of solo player base designs, it's still good to incorporate the landscape. P-Dizzle's design here, I really liked how he utilized the ridge line here in the terrain. So he built a tower up there, and he's beginning to wall off his main base. But that's also a cave base, and that cave was in a very unique location. So I thought he did a really great job of being able to find a very unique location, throw his flag down, and just start building. It was a smaller group, so it wasn't able to be a large compound like the one that we saw before, but I appreciate smaller compounds almost sometimes more, because they're more vulnerable. This is a compound by Black Ops Jesus here, who's a well-known player on Restopia, and this compound was very well honeycombed. It was very small. It's not the hardest base to raid, but again, as a solo player, you're going to get raided. But Black Ops Jesus did some really smart things. He kept putting resources into the base, kept honeycombing it, did use those high exterior stone walls, which he wanted to do, and he had a really interesting design there. This is some footage from DMG's design. He utilized that anvil-shaped rock, and if you want to see that in action and see how well that rock held up during a raid, go ahead and check out my most recent raid cam, which is called The Rock, and this base was tried to be raided, and it really held up to a lot of raiders. So as we wind down here, guys, we're just going to take a look at one other base here that I had some footage of, and I really like this design here, very symmetrical, and they also used a great use of the landscape and the natural terrain here that they built with their back to the water here, which gives them a natural bottleneck. As always, guys, really hope you enjoyed this week's Russ Cribs video. We'll have another one on the way next week. Fado82, peace.